The desert didn't warn her. That was the thing nobody ever talked about. Not the heat, not the distance, not the way sound carried differently at night when the air went flat and thin. The desert didn't warn you. It just took. Specialist Arden Voss had made it 400 meters past the eastern perimeter before the first shot came in. She didn't hear it so much as feel it. A displacement of air near her left shoulder, close enough to be a conversation, not close enough to end one. She dropped without thinking, chest hitting the packed sand, rifle already moving to her cheek before her knees had fully folded. That was muscle memory. That was 6 years of ranges and drills and 2 deployments and one very long conversation with herself on a cot in Kandahar about whether she actually wanted to keep doing this. She had decided yes. She was starting to question that decision. The second shot came from a different angle, which told her at least 2 shooters, possibly 3, positioned in a loose triangle around her extraction route. She cataloged this the way she cataloged everything. Quietly, without drama, the way her mother used to organize coupons on Sunday mornings. A place for everything. The mission simple. That was what Captain Holt had said. Simple. She was starting to question that too. 3 weeks earlier, Arden had been standing in front of a targeting board in a fob outside Tabuk, listening to the briefing and watching Captain Holt not look at her. It was a skill some officers had refined into an art form, the ability to look at a room and see everyone in it except for the one person who made them uncomfortable. Holt was a practitioner. He had been doing it since she arrived at the unit 8 months ago, and by now she had stopped waiting for it to change. The mission was ISR+, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, with an additional collection task that nobody wanted to say plainly. Get inside the network relay site at grid 447, pull the signal logs from the past 60 days, and get out without anyone knowing you'd been there. In and out, 72 hours max. The team would be 4. Holt had selected Kellerman, Voss, and Nauer as the primary elements. Arden was added almost as an afterthought, her name appearing on the assignment roster the night before departure, in a handwriting that suggested someone had revisited the decision and then revisited it again. She found out later that it was because of her Arabic. Not combat-grade survival phrases, but functional conversational Arabic, the kind you got when your father was a linguistics professor and thought it was more useful than piano lessons. Holt needed someone who could checkpoint conversation device with Arda translation device. It didn't mean Holt had to be happy about it. Voss, he said at the end of the briefing. Your rear security on infill. Stay tight. The other 3 men didn't react, but she noticed that Kellerman's jaw moved slightly like he was chewing on something he'd decided not to say out loud. She filed that away too. Rear security. She had qualified expert at Fort Benning. She had placed third out of 47 at the inter-unit shooting competition the previous spring, the one that the battalion commander had attended, and then personally shaken the hand of the second-place finisher without looking once at the woman standing next to him in third. She had the scores, she had the training record, and she was rear security. She said nothing. She picked up her kit and went to pack. The infill went clean for the first 18 hours. They moved at night, rested through the worst of the day heat under camouflage, netting stretched between 2 rock formations that the map labeled as terrain features and that Arden privately thought of as the most inhospitable place she had ever tried to sleep in her life. Voss snored. Nauer ate an entire bag of crackers one at a time with the focused intensity of a man diffusing something. Kellerman sat with his back against the rocks and watched the horizon like he expected it to come alive. She had run with teams before. You learn people fast in the field, not their biography but their rhythm. Voss was loud but reliable. Nauer was precise to the point of compulsiveness, which was annoying in camp and extremely useful when counting magazines. Kellerman was the one that gave her pause. Not because of anything he said, more because of what he didn't. On the 3rd hour of the second night's movement, crossing a long flat stretch of open ground that Arden hated on principle, too exposed, too much line of sight for anyone watching from elevation, Kellerman pulled alongside her and spoke quietly without turning his head. You run point tomorrow night. She waited, that was it. No elaboration. Copy, she said. He dropped back. She didn't look at him. She didn't. In her peripheral vision, she caught a glance from Nauer, just a flick, just a moment, before he looked away again. She didn't know what it meant. She decided not to assume. Running point meant she was out front, which was not rear security. She registered this and set it aside because the desert was cold and they were moving, and there would be time for other questions later. The relay site was smaller than she'd expected. Most things were when you got to them. Satellite imagery had a way of inflating importance, adding a sense of gravity to pixels that the actual structure never quite delivered. This was 3 interconnected trailers, a satellite array, a fuel dump behind a chain-link perimeter, and 2 guards who rotated on a schedule so predictable that she had mapped their pattern in 20 minutes of watching. She was on the north side. Kellerman and Nauer were working the antenna housing. Fosse was on the opposite perimeter, with eyes on the access road. The plan was for her to neutralize the near guard during the rotation gap. 8 seconds between when Guard 1 turned east and Guard 2 would become visible from his position, and hold the north side while the others worked inside. 8 seconds was plenty of time for what needed doing. She counted it twice. She executed. The guard went down quietly, in a way that suggested he had simply sat down and decided to rest, which was almost what had happened. She moved him into the shadow of the fuel pump housing and checked his breathing. Steady. He would wake up with a headache and a story that nobody would fully believe. She established her position at the north corner and settled in to wait. She waited 11 minutes before she heard the first shot from inside the facility. It was not part of the plan. She had 3 options and less than 4 seconds to choose between them. Move toward the sound and risk walking into whatever had gone wrong. Stay in position and maintain perimeter integrity. Pull back to the rally point and wait. She moved toward the sound. Later, she would decide this was correct. In the moment, she was operating on something that wasn't quite instinct and wasn't quite logic, but lived somewhere between them. A kind of informed urgency that the Army tried to train into people and occasionally succeeded. The interior of the main trailer was lit by a single work lamp when she came through the side access door. What she saw stopped her for approximately 1 full second before she began processing it. Kellerman was at the primary console, pulling drives, not downloading data. Pulling drives, physically removing storage hardware, which was not the mission, which was not what any of them were supposed to be doing, which was the kind of action that left a fingerprint visible from 1,000 miles away and told whoever owned this site exactly what had been taken. Voss was on the ground, not moving. The near side of his neck showed a wound that Arden processed and set aside in the same thought, because processing it further would not help him, and she needed to be useful. Nauer was against the far wall, with his weapon raised and pointed at Kellerman. "Put them down," Nauer said. He looked at Arden. His expression was the one she had been trying to read for 2 nights in the field, and now she understood what she hadn't been able to identify. It was the expression of someone who had already run the math and didn't like the remainder. "Voss," he said, "this doesn't have to be complicated." She was quiet for a moment. "Put them down," she said. Exactly what Nauer had said. Exactly the same words. Kellerman looked between them. The math shifted. He set the drives on the console. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the kind of operational complexity that briefings didn't cover, which was that securing a compromised team member with 1 person wounded and 1 dead, and a site that was now hot in a 53-minute window before the next guard rotation, that required improvisation of a specific and stressful kind. She zip-tied Kellerman to the equipment rack using his own field gear. She checked Voss. She confirmed what she had already processed. She told Nauer to finish the data pull, the actual mission pull, logs only, no hardware removed, while she reestablished perimeter. Nauer looked at her. "You're not senior," he said. "Not a challenge." A statement of fact, almost careful. "No," she said. "Do you want to discuss that right now?" He went to the console. She went back outside. The extraction went wrong at the 70-meter mark from the vehicle cache. She had the rear again, this time by choice, because she was the one who knew what was behind them and she wanted eyes on it. Nauer was ahead with the drive package. Kellerman was moving between them, wrists secured with a modified carry rig that Arden had constructed from 2 equipment straps and a piece of wire that she would later not be able to fully explain how she'd improvised in under 90 seconds. The first shot came from the ridge to the northeast. The second, from a position she couldn't immediately locate. She shoved Nauer forward hard toward the scrub brush at the edge of the wash and took a knee behind the only cover available. A broken section of old masonry, somebody's wall from somebody's century, half dissolved by wind. "Move," she said into the radio. "Get to the cache. Do not wait for me. Voss, go." She heard them moving. She kept her attention on the ridge. The thing about a firefight, the thing nobody wanted to say in the debrief because it sounded strange, was that it had a texture. Some were frantic and shapeless. Some had a logic to them that you could follow like a thread, if you were paying attention and if you weren't hit, and if the fear was in the background rather than the foreground. This one had a logic. Two shooters, working in coordination but not perfectly. There was a half-second offset in their timing that suggested they had trained together but not recently. They were trying to suppress, not eliminate, which meant they wanted something preserved. Either Kellerman or the drive package or both. She filed that. She moved. Short rushes, using the terrain brakes, letting the wall absorb 2 rounds that she heard but did not feel. She found a secondary position behind a rock formation and reassessed. The shooters were repositioning. She could hear it, small sounds, boot on stone, a breath taken and released. They were moving to an angle that would close her cover advantage in approximately 40 seconds. She had 38. She used 22 of them. One shooter went down. She heard rather than saw it. A specific quality of silence that followed. The second pulled back. She didn't pursue. Pursuit was indulgent, and she was already running behind on every timeline that mattered. She reached the vehicle cache in 11 minutes. The vehicle was gone. She stood in the empty scrub where the cache had been and spent exactly 5 seconds doing something she would later call reevaluation, and that in the moment was closer to a very controlled version of disbelief. They had left Nauer and Kellerman, wrists still tied, which meant Nauer had driven, had taken the vehicle and gone. The radio was silent, either out of range or off. She inventoried what she had. Weapon, 2 magazines, a personal medical kit, 40 ounces of water, a handheld GPS that was current on battery, a compass that needed none. The extraction point was 11 kilometers north-northwest. The alternate was 16 kilometers east. Primary comms were vehicle-mounted. Secondary was a small encrypted unit in her chest rig. She tried the secondary. Static, she tried again. Static, and then fragmented, there and gone. A carrier signal that told her someone in the net was active, even if they couldn't hear her. She began walking. The sun was up in 2 hours, and by the 4th hour it was a problem, and by the 6th hour it was the only problem, which was in some ways a clarification. She moved primarily by terrain, washes and depressions, anything that offered shadow, anything that cut the direct exposure. She drank carefully. She did not think about water past the calculation of what she had and how far it needed to take her, because thinking about it in any other way was not useful. She thought instead about Kellerman. The drives he had been pulling. She had seen the labeling in the moment, registered it, filed it in the back of her mind the way you filed things when there was too much happening to fully process. Red band labels, not standard mission data. Asset records, the kind that would be used to cross-reference human intelligence sources. Someone had sent them into that site to pull that information. Someone who knew the site layout, knew the rotation schedule, knew the drive locations. Kellerman had known exactly where to go, exactly what to pull, in a room he had never been in before. That meant the information had been given to him before they deployed, which meant someone on their side had provided it. She walked. The terrain shifted around noon, the flat pan giving way to a broken landscape of low ridges and dry riverbeds that were cooler in the shadow and harder on the footing. She twisted her left ankle on a loose stone and spent 90 seconds sitting on a rock, assessing. Not broken, badly sprained. She wrapped it from her kit, tight enough to hold, loose enough to maintain circulation, and stood up and continued. There was a version of this where she sat down and waited. She knew it existed. It wasn't available to her. Not because of stubbornness, which was an indulgence, but because sitting down meant the drives got to their destination and Fosse died for something that worked out for the wrong people, and she was not willing to allow that. She kept walking. At kilometer 9, she picked up the carrier signal again, clearer this time, and spent 15 minutes cycling through frequency until she got a partial handshake. Not a voice, just a data ping, but enough. She transmitted her position, her status, and 3 words that she chose carefully because she had limited battery and limited certainty about who was listening. Drive package compromised. She released the transmit key. She walked. The extraction point was a flat open area near an abandoned agricultural structure. Stone walls, no roof, the kind of place that looked like it had been empty for decades, and probably had been. She reached it 4 hours before the scheduled window and sat in the shadow of the north wall and did something she hadn't permitted herself to do for the previous 11 kilometers, which was to be still. Her ankle hurt. Her water was gone. The sun was moving toward the western ridgeline, and the air was beginning to cool in the way that the desert managed. Not gradually, but in stages, like something had made a decision. She thought about Voss. She thought about the way Kellerman had looked at her in the trailer, the math running behind his eyes. She thought about whether Nauer had known, had been part of it, had made a different calculation at the last moment, and chosen the mission data over Kellerman's objectives, or whether he had simply panicked and run and taken the only transport available. She didn't know. She filed it. She thought about Captain Holt, about the briefing room, and the way he hadn't looked at her, about rear security, about the assignment roster with her name added at the last minute. She had been added because of her Arabic. She wondered now whether that was the whole reason, or whether someone had wanted her there for something else. A body in the field that could be explained if things went sideways. A specialist, not an officer. Easy paperwork. She didn't know this either. She was aware that she was speculating in a direction that led nowhere useful, and she stopped. She checked her secondary radio. Battery low. She conserved it. She waited. The helicopter came in at dusk, which was standard for the unit and which she had not been certain would actually happen until she heard the rotors. She stood up from the wall and moved into the open ground and marked her position with an IR strobe clipped to her vest, pointing skyward. The bird came in fast and settled hard. 2 people out the side door, not the crew, which meant they had sent bodies, which meant her transmission had landed somewhere useful. One of them was Lieutenant Colonel Darren Marsh, which told her the situation had escalated past the tier she'd expected. He looked at her ankle. He looked at her water rig. Empty, visible, not something she'd tried to hide. He looked at her face. "Where's the team?" he said. "Kellerman is your problem," she said. "Nauer brought the drive package in, or he ran. I don't know yet. Voss is at grid." She gave him the grid. Exactly, from memory. Marsh didn't write it down. His expression moved through something, not disbelief, more like the particular adjustment that experienced officers made when the situation was different from what the radio traffic had suggested, and different in a way that required recalibration. "Whose call was it to leave you?" he said. "Nauer's, I assume. Unless Kellerman had enough range of motion. He had a weapon, not after the first 2 minutes. He did have the ability to be extremely persuasive." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "Get on the bird," he said. She got on the bird. The debrief lasted 6 hours, which was long even by the standards of situations that required long debriefs. She told it in sequence, without editorializing, without characterizing anyone's intent beyond what she had directly observed. She answered questions when they were asked. She asked for water twice and received it both times, which she found faintly notable. At hour 4, a man she hadn't met came into the room and placed a folder on the table in front of her and opened it to a photograph. A network diagram, nodes and connections, the kind of chart that intelligence analysts assembled over months from fragments of signal and source information. "Recognize any of these?" he said. She looked. She found the relay site. She found 3 other locations she had not known about. She followed the connections. She looked at the man. "Where did this come from?" she said. "The drive package," he said. "The logs you pulled." She looked at the diagram again. She thought about Kellerman and the red band drives and the information that someone on their side had given him before deployment. She thought about the shape of it. "The drives he was trying to pull," she said. "The asset records. If he'd gotten those out, whoever runs this network would have known their exposed sources within hours." "Yes," the man said. "And they would have rolled them up." "Yes." She looked at the diagram. "How many?" she said. "Active assets in this network. Before tonight, we weren't certain we could account for all of them. Tonight, with what came off those logs, we can." He didn't give her a number. She didn't ask for one. She understood that the number was large enough that it wasn't something you said out loud in a debrief room without preparation. She looked at the diagram for another moment. She looked at the connections. She thought about Fossey, who was dead, who had a family somewhere that did not yet know. She thought about her ankle, which had been wrapped by a medic 2 hours ago and was now elevated on a second chair. She thought about 11 kilometers in a desert with no water and a bad radio and a sprained ankle. She said nothing. The man closed the folder. "We're going to need to talk to you again," he said. "I'll be here," she said. The formal report submitted by Captain Holt. Submitted, she would later learn, while she had been on the ground waiting for extraction. Described the mission outcome as inconclusive. A team loss, intelligence possibly compromised, personnel status unknown on one element. She did not see this report when it was filed. She saw it later. because someone felt she should know, and because the person who showed it to her did so with the specific expressionlessness of someone delivering information they personally disagreed with. She read it twice. She handed it back. He didn't know what the logs would show, she said. The person across the table from her waited. By the time he wrote this, he didn't know what had been recovered or what it meant. So this was written to cover a situation where the mission failed, and I was the forward element. She was quiet for a moment. He put me on point. First night in country, I was rear security. By the third night, I was on point. That was Kellerman's call, not his, but he approved the rotation. What does that tell you? The person said. She thought about it carefully. That someone wanted me in front, she said. Out front and accountable, or out front and expendable? I don't know yet, which? We're working on that, the person said. She nodded once. She thought about the way Holt had not looked at her in the briefing room. She thought about her name on the roster, added at the last minute in a different handwriting. She thought about rear security, and then point, and then 11 kilometers alone, through the dark and the heat. She thought about Voss. The log data, she said. The sources it identified. They're going to be moved. Already started, the person said. And Kellerman's contact, whoever invited him, the site layout. We have a direction, the person said. Not a confirmation. A direction. She accepted that. She understood the difference between what an investigation had and what it could say. She sat in the chair with her ankle elevated and her hands flat on the table, and she did not feel what everybody expected to feel at the end of it. Not relief exactly, and not satisfaction, because Fossey was dead, and the network had nearly burned 36 people, and none of that resolved cleanly into a feeling you could name. She felt something more like the texture of continuing, like what came after the last kilometer, when you reached the wall and sat down and waited, not because the work was done, but because the next part was someone else's, and you had done yours. 7 weeks later, Staff Sergeant Arden Voss was promoted. The ceremony was small. A room, a flag, 3 people who had been present for the relevant conversations. Marsh read the citation language in the tone of someone who had written it himself and meant every word, which was something she could identify by then. He pinned the rank. He shook her hand. He did not say anything that addressed Holt's report directly, because that was a different process that was ongoing in a different room. He didn't need to. The room they were standing in was its own kind of statement. She thanked him. She meant it. Walking out, she favored her left ankle slightly, not as much as she had 2 weeks ago. Less than she would have expected, it was healing. Things did that, given time and the right conditions. She thought about the 11 kilometers. She thought about the moment she had stood in the empty cache site and understood the vehicle was gone, and how there had been a version where she sat down, and how she had decided that version wasn't available to her. Not because of stubbornness, because the work wasn't finished. It was now, or this part of it was. There would be more. There was always more. That was the nature of the kind of work that didn't get named out loud. But this part was closed, with the right outcome in the right column, and the people who had needed to be found had been found, and the people who had needed to be moved were moving. She walked out into the afternoon. The sun was where it was supposed to be. The air was dry. Off to the east, the sky had a quality she recognized, the particular flatness that came before the heat settled and the night came in. She had been in worse places. She had come back from them.